come over here and then come. So there we go. That gives a nice start point when I edit to say welcome everyone, welcome. As you can see from the bottom, we're back in Matthew 15, 29 to 39 today, which I'm calling 7 baskets full. So we're now we're going to be looking at the feeding of the 4,000 today, and in many ways this is quite a nice one for me to be able to kind of address coming back, because it's nice and contained, but it's as we've been trying to kind of explain over the last few weeks, although Matthew is not strictly chronological, we can piece the chronology together from the other Gospels, and actually we see kind of something of a flow going on at a kind of a meta level. In other words, if you kind of take a slightly wider look at what's going on in Matthew, we can see that focus is beginning to shift. And the story of the feeding of the 5,000 makes most sense within that kind of that meta-narrative shift. And so we'll kind of we'll present it in that kind of context. So if we come to the text as Matthew puts it, so having departed from there, so you remember Jesus has been up in the Tyre and Sidon area, so he's been up in that region, and we've had the incident of the Syrophoenician woman and the kind of the way she responds, and Jesus has kind of put the question, or he's made the statement which his disciples have heard, well, I'm called to the lost children of Israel, just to those people, and yet here she is, and she pushes herself into the story a bit like kind of a Ruth or someone. She gets involved in the way she responds, and Jesus then heals her. And it's out of that context, having departed from there, that's the there that is in reference here. Jesus came near to the Sea of Galilee. But having gone up into the mountain, he sat there, and I'm going to finish the 3 verses and then we'll go back to the beginning. And great crowds came to him. So Jesus somehow appears. He's near to, he's in the proximity of, is the Greek word that's used there. So he's not right on the edge, he's not right by the Sea of Galilee, but he's within its proximity. But he's in a mountain, he sits down, and for some reason crowds start coming to him. As we'll see, we get a bit more of the story, the background to this in Mark's Gospel. Having lame, crippled, blind and mute many others with them, and they placed him at his feet, and he healed them. So that the crowd marvelled, seeing the mute speaking, the crippled restored, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And then here the final little statement, and they glorified the God of Israel. And here in Matthew's Gospel, we get a single hint of something which we see a little bit more explicitly when we match this story from the Gospel of Mark. So as you already know, because I put it up front, 7 baskets full, this is the feeding of the 4,000. So there's been, it was one of those interesting kind of, I remember as when I was at school, I chose to do, in my 6th form at school, I chose to do RE as an optional O level, because I'd just recently been healed, so I was a bit more enthusiastic. And I can remember realising as we went through Mark's Gospel that Matthew and Mark have the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And if you just put them next to each other, it's kind of like, well, here's a big miracle, 5,000 people, 12 baskets, and here's a slightly smaller miracle, less people, 4,000, less baskets. And you kind of think to yourself, well, why are they there? And it is a really important kind of question to ask. Why are they both there? And I realised as well that if Luke's Gospel, for instance, had told us about the healing of the 4,000 and not the healing of the 5,000, the critics would be saying, oh, you see, the stories grew in the telling. Luke's telling us the original, but here they are, both of them, in Matthew and in Mark. So they are clearly, and as we kind of put these things together, the stories have been chosen by the apostles together, as we're seeing, as the way I'm very aware I continuously share from my perspective on these things, but that as Matthew's Gospel representing the kind of body of teaching that has been selected together by the 12 disciples in Jerusalem as being the core to what they want to get across to the nascent church. They've chosen both of these stories. Now, in Matthew's Gospel, perhaps the reason why they've been chosen is only hinted at to us. And that hint comes in that final line of verse 31. They glorified the God of Israel. They don't just glorify God, they glorify the God of Israel, because as we're going to see, if you then compare this, which I've done, there you go, there's a nice little animated graphic there, impressive. That the God of Israel is qualified here because they're not necessarily all Jewish. And when I say not necessarily, I'm trying to be true to the text rather than be dogmatic and say none of them are or whatever. And I'll explain a little bit about that now. So what I've got here, I put it in a slightly different format. This is taken from the little manuals I put together a few years back to kind of integrate the gospel. So this is Mark's account. So he says, after they departed from the borders of Tyre and Sidon, they came to the Sea of Galilee, through the midst of the region of Decapolis. So that little phrase, the midst of the region of Decapolis. Now, it's kind of amongst the borders is the kind of literal way of saying it. So Jesus has arrived amongst the borders. Now, does that mean he's in the middle of Decapolis, or does it mean he's at the edge? And you'll find there's a bit of a debate, and we'll think about why and what's going on here. And then what we first read about is that they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay hands on him. So Jesus has come into a region, and it's in Decapolis, the 10 cities, which is a non-Jewish area. It's a predominantly Greek-speaking. Jesus has been there once before when he delivers the Gadarene demoniac, if you remember, and there are a herd of pigs that rush down, and actually that suddenly gives us some context. Oh, okay, this is the region. It's a Greek region rather than a Jewish region. It's over on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And so Jesus is in an area where he's not normally there. Now, he's just come from Tyre and Sidon, the Gentile area, where he's gone to retreat from the crowds, the Jewish crowds. There has been this kind of question or challenge as to his role to the Gentiles, which Jesus has never hidden in Matthew's Gospel. In the commissioning of the 10, he talks about when they stand before kings and governors and so on. There's always been a wider mission within the focus of the Gospel of Matthew. But it's kind of hit this little moment where in trying to, if you like, the crowds are so intense for Jesus around Galilee that he can hardly move to minister. So he's gone away from there, gone to an area where he's less well known, but actually now even the Gentiles are beginning to find out and been pushing in. A question has been raised in the context of the disciples. Jesus has answered it by healing the woman's daughter, and then they've left that region and they've come into the region of Decapolis, which is again outside of, if you like, Jesus's home base. It's near the Sea of Galilee, but it's the opposite side. It's the wrong side. So in that context where Jesus has been once before, he's healed a man who's oppressed by the demonic spirit, which he calls Legion. And it's kind of interesting that there is a legion, a Roman legion based in the region of Decapolis, so it's kind of part of the spirit of the age, and he's delivered him from it, and he's actually told him to go back and tell folks. Now, so often Jesus tells people not to spread about what he's done for them, but actually that's normally in the Jewish context where the crowds are growing so fast. And for the sake of kind of timing, I think Jesus is having to manage his own ministry. So the feeding of the 5,000, we're told in John's Gospel, happens just before Passover. And then from the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus has not gone down to Passover. Jesus is missing Passover in 32 AD. They're kind of therefore going up into Tyre and Sidon is probably at the time when the crowds are all turning up now to Jerusalem for Passover. Jesus is kind of getting away from that. Perhaps because if he had gone down to Passover and the crowds and everything else, he would have been crucified the wrong year, if I can put it that way. It would have all happened too quickly. So Jesus is kind of, in one sense, he is managing the time and consistency of the place of his mission and ministry. Pardon me. Now you get hints of this as you put the four Gospels together, right the way through Jesus' last year, the kind of pushing out and the focus towards what's going to happen now with the Gentiles. And that makes sense of the writing of Matthew's Gospel and then Mark's Gospel. Mark is more explicit about this kind of Gentile agenda, but Mark is written in the context of Rome with Gentile believers there, whereas Matthew is written in the context of the Jerusalem church, kind of hinting at the fact, because they're worshipping the God of Israel, but actually kind of still within that sort of home base environment. And so anyway, so we read about how Jesus has got there, something of the testimony and who he is broken into this non-Jewish area, and someone brings this deaf man, and slowly, because it's taking place over a period of days, as we're going to find out, the word is going out and more folks are coming in, but they're in a remote location, they're away from the big towns, and as the crowds kind of gather. So just kind of, there we go, I put a little kind of basic map up there. So it would seem, if you like, that Jesus has skirted around the top and come down on the eastern side, which is not, it's the western side where his huge base is in Galilee. Obviously we know that Philip has come from Bethsaida, and there are people who push over the Jordan a little bit into Trachonitis, but as you get down into Decapolis, it's less and less Jewish and more Greek. So, going on in Matthew, and so Jesus called to his disciples and said, "I'm moved with compassion for this crowd, because they have stayed with me here for 3 days already and have nothing to eat." So I guess that's starting from that first healing. There's the deaf mute who's been brought to him. He's now got healed and the word is going out. There is the memory of the testimony of the man who's delivered from the legion, that Jesus is told to go back and tell everybody. And now Jesus says, "I'm not willing to send them away unfed, lest they faint on the way." Now, given the context, there is a kind of, if you like, a sense of challenge to the disciples. They've already been with Jesus in a very similar situation, and Jesus has fed the crowd. They've also been with Jesus, and there has been a challenge towards feeding a Gentile, or giving the Gentile woman who's being fed by the crumbs that fall from the table, and so it's almost like, okay, I feel compassion for them. I'm not willing to send them away lest they faint on the way. And so you get the questions going on in the disciples' heads. But the disciples kind of missed the boat to a degree. We're in a remote place. Where can we find enough bread to feed such a large crowd? And Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" You see, so they should start to get it. And they said 7 and a few small fish. So we remember the disciples themselves have authorized this telling, this gospel. They're setting themselves up to kind of illustrate that it's taking them time to really kind of get the message through, or Jesus to get the message through. So Jesus, having encouraged the crowds to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves and the fish, he gave thanks and broke them, gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. So and they all ate, and they were satisfied, and they collected up the leftover fragments, 7 large baskets full. And I've hyphenated the large baskets. Probably could just put baskets, but to contrast, if you remember when we looked at the feeding of the 5,000, there were 12 hand baskets. So the two Greek words are different, just that we use the word basket in English. One is a small hand basket, and the other is a slightly larger basket. This, I think it's spurio, something like that is the Greek word. The basket that's used here is the kind of basket that Paul is let down. You remember when Paul is he has to get away from, he goes up to Damascus, and when he has to leave Damascus, they let him out the window in a basket. So it's baskets big enough for somebody to get into, if I can put it that way. So actually there is a kind of a contrast, although it's 7 rather than 12, but the 12 baskets were small, kind of like little things that the disciples are kind of wandering around the camp with. They've all got their small basket, got any leftovers, collect them up. Whereas now we have these much more substantial baskets, big enough that if you want to, you can stick a person in it and hang them out of the window, and it's strong enough and large enough and so on. And then it kind of comments that those eating were 4,000 men besides women and children. So we're coming near to the end of the text, but I wanted to again put this context. It seems to me very clear that there's something, if you like, of a lifting our eyes towards the Gentiles. I can remember many years ago hearing that as well from Martin Goldsmith, if anyone remembers Martin Goldsmith, who was an Anglican who's converted Jewish. And now I mention that because here he is as a Jewish man, recognizing here in the feeding of the 4,000 the mission to the Gentiles. And the reason I'm saying that, pardon me, getting there, is I was surprised when I was just kind of pulling the text together for this, and I had a quick look online, and I suddenly discovered there's a whole host of people who really object to the idea of the people that Jesus is ministering to here being Gentiles. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I just, it made such sense of the kind of the flow of the text to me. And you hear people kind of arguing about when it talks about in the midst of the borders, it doesn't mean that here are all the four borders and this is in the middle of it. What it means is they're in the borderlands and they're on the Jewish side of the borderlands. These aren't Gentiles. They can't be Gentiles because Jesus has just said to the Syrophoenician woman, I'm not called to the Gentiles at the moment. And she was the exception, not the rule. Therefore, this definitely isn't. I thought, well, there's quite a lot of emotion about this, if I can put it that way. I wonder, I'm very open. I want to be challenged. I don't want to kind of say I can see this 100% and so on. It makes sense to me, that approach. I wonder why it's so emotionally important for folks. And then I found out, but you had to read right the way through some of the critiques. And it turns out that there are, so I'm just flagging it, that you will therefore sometimes, because the way these things, then people go, they can get very, very certain on something that is a kind of a useful qualification. By what I mean is, it seems to me that this is within the flow of something that's going on in Matthew's Gospel. And it seems to me that these are Gentiles. And here is the reason. They refer to the God of Israel rather than just God. They're giving thanks to the God of Israel as if they have to qualify that, because there could be other gods that we would be qualifying. So that's why Matthew uses God of Israel. And so then the opponents will say, but in the Old Testament, sometimes the phrase God of Israel is used, and that's referring still to Jews saying it, so Jews could say that. But then you'd say, well, normally when that is the case in the Old Testament, it's because there are nations around them, and so we are making the point it is in that way. But So it seems to me in that flow, but it seems, well, as I unpacked it all, what you found is the reason why people don't like it to be non-Jews. That's why I also mentioned it was Martin Goldsmith, who I first remember kind of like, spelling it all out as a Jewish convert himself, that this is beginning to see the opening up of Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles, which is not the focus of his life and work, which happens within a Jewish context. He is crucified in Jerusalem because it's the right place prophetically. It's where we see the meaning and understand what he has come to do. But the Gentiles have always been in view, right the way since God says to Abraham that in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So that flow that makes sense to me. The reason they don't like it is because it doesn't fit a dispensationalist theology of salvation. So, I mean, and I found that right at the bottom of some of these articles and of course you can see why this does not fit. And it's worth me flagging that because I'll express my own prejudice. So, I'm assuming a lot of folks will know what I mean when I say a dispensationalist view of salvation. The dispensationalist view is quite a late view if you look at kind of general Christian theology, but very, very popular in the US and in certain kind of Pentecostal streams. And in it, there are different seasons by which you have to do different things to get saved. You see, so in the days of Adam, people got saved one way, and then once Abraham came, they got saved by being good Israelites, and then and normally as people do it, the thing is, it becomes very often quite sort of forensic in the sense of what happens if you died, supposing you were Jewish and Jesus had now arrived. So now Jesus has arrived. You now get saved, not by being Jewish, but you need to kind of recognize the Messiah. But then Jesus dies and is risen again, he's died, and he may have risen again, but Pentecost hasn't happened yet, so the church doesn't exist. So you get these little kind of weird little units, like so for that period between resurrection and Pentecost, there's a different dispensation. You have to do different things to get saved from when Jesus was alive, which is different from if you lived in the years or months just before Jesus came. And at one level, it can go, in my mind, it all gets rather bitty. But fundamentally, the reason why I have this prejudice against that approach to the things is it undermines the value of the cross. Because it kind of, it's like God has chosen arbitrary ways in which you get saved, regardless of your response to Jesus. Whereas my own understanding is that it's always been exactly the same way. Our salvation is based on our response, a relational response to what level of revelation we have of the Word. If you were Abraham, you had encountered the Word of God when he turns up and he talks with you. You don't know the name Jesus. You don't know that he was born of a Virgin Mary and suffered under Pontius Pilate when the Word became flesh and lived among us. But you are encountering God's Word, the manifestation of the unknowable God making himself known into creation. And so Jesus is able to say of Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. And he seems to be referring to the point where he's going to sacrifice, he thinks, Isaac. And Isaac says, we haven't got a sacrifice. And he says he looks up and saw off. And then he says, but God himself will provide. And Jesus says, he saw my day and it was reckoned to him as faith. He responds to something that he understands of the revelation he has of the Word of God, the pre-incarnate Word. So for me, everything is consistent. It's always been that way. And if I was born in Borneo in the centuries before any Christian missionary came, I might have some sense of the revelation of God that has kind of come within our context, and I might respond and relate to that, and that becomes a factor in how God sees me and deals with me. So then people will say, but then why should we ever bother going and carrying the gospel? Well, because the gospel makes it much clearer and makes it much easier. Jesus says it's narrow way and few find it. If you remember, we looked at that passage. The gospel is a message we can get our heads around and makes it easier for people to understand and to pass on. And it's that passing on is part of the way that more get saved than if we didn't do it. If that makes sense. So anyway, in taking the time to explain that is I want to explain my own prejudices. I'm quite happy to share those with you. So they are but within that flow, therefore, this passage makes sense to me to understand and see that Jesus is now, his ministry is now beginning to be it's kind of reaching its pinnacle or its peak within Galilee. Jesus is, shortly after this, is now going to relocate down to the south, and then over the next year, his ministry is going to pinnacle and peak in the southern regions of Judea, so Galilee and Judea, but it's beginning to spill over into the Gentile areas. And the mission to the Gentiles is starting to kind of hit the view of the disciples, and so in that context, we look at there were 5,000, and they collected up 12 hand baskets. It's like, and 12 obviously has a governmental role in Jewish kind of symbolic numbers. But so does 7, of course, and it's a smaller number, but it's a more significant number. So 12 is about God's kind of government, and if you like, within God's purposes, within his people, there's something of that left in the hand baskets that are collected over. But these 7 large baskets, 7, the word Sabbath, once you remove the vowel markers, which didn't exist in Jesus' day, the word for Sabbath is the same as the word for an oath. If you remember the name Elizabeth, the Sabbath in Elizabeth is the word promise. That's God's promise, or God's oath. So 7 is also something that is a number that is a promise. It promises. It also speaks of completeness. So I often say it's like a complete promise. And here, a year or so before before Pentecost, because it seems like probably Passover has just happened shortly after the feeding of the 4,000, a little bit later than that. So around the same period, Pentecost. Here is a 7 baskets being gathered as a kind of a promise of a kind of a response or a harvest or ministry into the Gentile world. So that's how I see the passage fitting within the flow. It's more explicit in Mark's Gospel because Mark's Gospel is written more explicitly to a Gentile church up in Rome, or has been prepared for that church up in Rome. But it's used the same selection of events and so on that Matthew represents, because his was the original kind of collection that were seen as being, these are the things we're going to teach what Jesus taught us from these events, but it was still there implicitly in Matthew's Gospel too. So we'll just moving on to the last final verse. And having dismissed the crowds, he entered into the boat and came to the region of Magadan, or Magdala, the region of Magdala. Magadan is assumed, therefore, to be around Magdala. On the map, you can see I put the little X there. The town that was found there is assumed to be Magdala. It can't be proved 100%, but it got a certain definite boost up in that Mark's Gospel refers to Jesus going to the region of Dalmanutha. In 2013, do you remember when they found they uncovered the fishing vessel? Do you remember they were saying it's just like the one that Jesus would have had? The professor, the archaeologist who uncovered that, it was part actually of discovering a region just short distance to the south of what we think is as Magdala, and the actual people, the team that excavated, said, well, this would make sense if this is Dalmanutha, because in the Gospels it talks about Magdala on the coast, but we found this town, which is what we assume is Magdala, and now there's a region just a little bit down to the south of it, which is another built-up area, which is for the processing of fish, and that's probably therefore Dalmanutha. So while it's not 100% proven, it's to me it kind of seems pretty certain. If you take the gospel narrative seriously and you've got the archaeology, you've got these two locations that kind of fit the ideas that go with them in the right location, just kind of give you a sense. So Jesus has come round. He's come from Tyre and Sidon, right in the north. He's come right the way round, avoiding the areas where he's big news already. He's now heading back into them, but not by walking along the coast where he would encounter lots of people, but by taking a boat straight across. And we're getting ready for Jesus's kind of move to go and see his parents, probably for the Jewish New Year, and after that to relocate down to the south. But in the middle of this, we've kind of had this kind of period from Passover through Pentecost where we've been starting to kind of push out and have our eyes raised to the Gentile world that's going to come next. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on the text. Did anyone want to ask anything or make any comments at this stage? There we go. Thanks for watching.
I just wanted to clarify. I think I missed something. It might have been my internet, or I've just found it slightly odd at one or two places. But you said Matthew was clearly in the context of the Jerusalem church, but Mark, you said, was more explicit on something, but I missed it.
Yeah. So the early church records of how the Gospels are written are that Matthew's written first. And actually, there were then, but of course, by the time we know, by Luke writes about others, and Mark's Gospel, we are told from various different ancient sources, not just one or two, that Mark has gone to Rome with Peter. Peter's preached in Rome. At some point, Peter leaves. One of the passages, it sounds like he dies, but then in others, he comes back, and the word can just mean he's departed in the sense of he's left. After he leaves, Mark, who's been with him and who's been listening to him all of the time, has probably been part of the Jerusalem church, and puts, if you like, the memories of Peter's sermons that he preached of the gospel down, which is then gives us Mark's gospel. So he's probably got a version of Matthew's gospel with him, but he's talking now to a Latin and Greek speaking church. We're actually told that it's some of the Praetorian Guard that request the written text. And one of the early church fathers tells it as members of the Praetorian. He writes it down. We're then also told by another of the early church that when Peter comes back, he didn't object to it, nor did he he just he was fine with it. In other words, he came back and was happy with that. So there's quite a rich kind of history of Mark's gospel gets produced for the church in Rome. And that's why it's based on Peter's perspective, which it is. If you read Mark's gospel, whereas Matthew's gospel will talk about the disciples and they, Mark's gospel talks about us, because it's Peter talking about, I'm doing this, and I went with him when he raised up and so it's we went in. This happened to us because he's one of the three people, Peter, James, and John, who's with Jesus for some of those incidents. So it's kind of clear within the text that if you like, Peter type perspective, and that makes sense of the way the kind of gospel is written. So
Mark's gospel, was it written in Greek then?
I think it was written in Greek, yes. So I think Greek was the lingua franca that everybody spoke. So I think in the reference to Matthew writing originally in Hebrew and others translating, that his would have been probably just seen as, well, he's sort of translated Matthew's gospel, but he's done it from Peter's perspective, because Peter's the one who's been up there, which is why you get so much more kind of Peter's eyewitness details in the gospel. So Mark basically often shortens the story, but increases the perspective. So we think of, if you often think, oh, Mark's the short gospel, but when you actually look, there are a lot less incidents than there are in Matthew's gospel, but when you read them, they have a lot more eyewitness detail in them. And that kind of makes sense of it coming out of Peter's preaching, whereas the gospel that's been prepared in Jerusalem has been prepared by all of the disciples and has been done in a more generic way, so has a lot of incidents in it, but done at a kind of a basic sort of level because it's going to be distributed and taught by people who weren't necessarily there as eyewitnesses. So those are my prejudicial views. I'm very honest about the fact that they are always perspective, but there are reasons for sometimes why we hold the perspectives we do. Which is why I was saying I don't buy in. I don't have a need for Jesus not to do any missions work to large-scale Gentiles, because I don't share a dispensationalist view of how you get saved. And the reason I don't hold that view, partly, is because when you get into it, the cross isn't necessary. It's just another choice. You could have done it this way, could have done it that way, because actually God is so controlling of everything that happens. It's just the way he's put it together. That always in the end ends up undermining the value of the cross, or the real agency that Jesus has when he lives the life he does. So that's why I'm not so keen on it.
Totally understand and agree.
Good. Any other thoughts or questions anyone would like to ask or raise or point out? Come on, Colin. You got your microphone working now. I'm sure you got to have a good question. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I've got a question. I hadn't come across before the idea that there was a way of getting saved between Jesus' resurrection and his ascent and Pentecost, and then it's changed. I wasn't aware of that thinking.
Well, that thinking won't be necessarily all dispensationalist, but it's in the kind of the debates that people have, and very often people like to have 7 dispensations. You see, so now where do you create your 7 dispensations? How do we? Because 7 seems like an important number. So we can all kind of buy before the fall. There's one dispensation. After the fall, up to Abraham, there's another dispensation. Abraham up to the coming of Jesus. That's number 3, is it? And 1, 2, 3, or number 4. Then when Jesus is alive, and then someone at some points out, well, what about when he's died, but we haven't yet, the Pentecost hasn't come, so the church isn't there. What about those people there? Are they part of this or part of that? So some people kind of argue for one in there. Then there's the church age, and then of course when we all get raptured, and then in for a few 3.5 years there's another dispensation right at the end of everything. Just so you know, I don't buy into that. I'm just telling you that's the way these things are often broken up. And as I say, there's often a desire to make there be 7, because that feels right to people, that there'll be 7 dispensations.
Yeah, it's a nice number, isn't it? So,
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah. Whereas, as I say, for me, in my simplistic way, it's always been, how have we responded to whatever revelation of the word? Now we have part of our revelation of that word is Jesus Christ, born of a virgin, suffered under Pontius Pilate, died on a Friday, resurrected on a Sunday. We've got a very concrete narrative with a great prophetic kind of foundation to it that we can share and engage people in conversation with. So there is a greater opportunity to discover that place and that revelation. But equally, it's always been there. It's the way Paul makes that they're without excuse. God's character and knowledge is being revealed in different ways, and it's not our place to kind of to restrict people from a kind of a possibility in God's judgment and assessment of them that is based on that more general process.
A reason that going to another point where Jesus sometimes says, "Don't say who I am," but then in this particular case he said, "Do say who I am." Some thoughts that I've been told was that in the Jewish areas there where the zealots were prominent, and that people would have misunderstood. They would have thought Jesus was coming to be the leader of Israel.
Yeah,
whereas
so
in the Gentile areas, that thinking wasn't present, so he was freer to tell people.
No, I think fundamentally, because these are all, there'll be a host of things. I think that's part of the mix. That Jesus is not that the knowledge of Jesus grows fast anyway in those areas, and actually in terms of, as I say, just Jesus not being able in the period before he goes up to Tyre and Sidon, we that period where it talks about the crowds being around him and people not being able to move, that actually the speed by which things happen, there's various things going on at the same time. So I think because it's often one of those confusing things. Why does sometimes Jesus say tell people and other times he says not to? But I think the issue of Jesus managing how the knowledge is getting out is a part of the answer to that. That in certain context, he doesn't need to say don't. In some he does need to say don't. In some he needs to do it the opposite way around, which is go and share that testimony about a bit. And that's probably opening up the ground for a future mission that happens in the days of the Book of Acts.
I was interested, Kristen, that the basket size was different and not something that we get in our text.
No.
And it seems to me that maybe there were way more bits picked up anyway this time than the last. If the basket size,
that's the impression you normally get. And as I say, it's not a great revelation. That's been spotted for a long time, particularly because just people who do read the Greek will notice that it's the same kind of basket that's used to let Paul out of the window in. so it's kind of, not only is it different, but actually it's a big one. So I think there is something of size. I think that we are supposed to get, because the other thing not to forget, of course, which I didn't touch on today, but actually Jesus is going to revisit this and say, do you remember the difference? Do you remember so actually Jesus is going to look back on these and say, remember when you were there, what happened, how many baskets, remember when we were there, why is that? And if you just say, well, they're just two things the same, which effectively, then actually even that reflection back is just kind of to say you've got little faith, you should have had more faith the second time. Whereas actually if you're looking back because there's something significant, there's something developmental, and actually the idea of a greater harvest, if you like, a greater harvest within a Gentile area, even though there was a smaller crowd. But that's and done with less testimony and less understanding of the prophetic and any of those things. But still, that was there. There's a whole host of different possible things to learn by looking back at this. When you see the differences.
Can you explain a little bit more about the 12 and the governmental aspect?
So I think, just obviously because of the fact that there were the 12 tribes, although when it comes to numbers in the Old Testament, I regularly will drop it in the Little Jesus Centre books. I'll say, that in the ancient world, numbers have far the balance. Every time we use a number, there's a balance between its symbolic use and its quantitative use. What's the quantity? What's the symbol? And that's true even in the modern world, But if I say I'll be a couple of minutes, I don't mean I will be 100% precisely 120 seconds. But roughly what I mean. We kind of use things in a symbolic sense. Now, if you go back into the ancient world, it's not just in Judaism, just all of the ancient world, numbers, if something's about 40 and 40 represents something symbolically that is, but you'll say it's 40, if I can. And when you're, and most people don't, but when you try and reconcile numbers through the Old Testament, it's not difficult to do if you accept that. If you don't, if it always has to be 100% literally 40, then you get all sorts of little problems where you get missing kind of decades sometimes. Now, we're often just not confronted with that, and why should we be? There's so much to learn in the Bible, but actually it's not really a problem very often from a scholarship point of view. You just say, okay, it's saying basically a generation. So a generation, and it's not the way we use the idea of a generation. For us, a generation is about 20 people, and there are certain periods in late Israeli history where they use the idea of a generation is more like 20 years. But on the whole, in the ancient world, it's kind of like I get born and 40 plus years later, people are preparing, getting ready to leave this mortal coil. So we kind of treat the 40 years as being I've lived a kind of a lifetime. If I can, I've lived a productive lifetime. So therefore, sometimes we will find those numbers kind of recurring and they become a summary. And in the context of which they were written, nobody is telling a lie. They're using a word with its kind of mystical stroke symbolic meaning, just has more weight when I hear it. So I know what it is you're trying to say to me in terms of those things. So anyway, why am I going off? Oh yeah, so within that context, sorry, that's what I was saying, because actually the idea of the 12 tribes of Israel, as is pointed out, keeps on. There are various ways of counting them up, and actually you can count the tribes of Israel. We know that there are the two half tribes. We refer to those, Ephraim and Manasseh, so that's okay. But sometimes Joseph is referred to as a tribe, like in the book of Revelation, as a whole tribe. There's a list of them in, I think, the book of Judges, where there's actually only 7 tribes at this point. But the number becomes, if you like, not literally that there are the 12 of them together, but they sum up the whole nation, that the 12 sums up the whole nation and God's kind of authority and its leadership and so on. And so Jesus appoints 12 of his disciples. Well, that number kind of says this is at some level, if you like, the whole of what God is going to do in his new phase, the church, is summed up in this 12. And that's why we have the 12, even though there are always others with them. And even though one of them falls away and gets lost, but he gets replaced, so that the number is still always there's the 12. And so in that kind of a context, when there are, there's something about in the collecting of the 12 baskets. Probably is because the disciples went out with a hand basket each, and each came back with one. But of course, the number kind of represents everything God's doing. But the number 7, very often, as I say, because the Sabbath, as in Elisabeth, God's promise, God's oath, which is what the name means, is spelt exactly the same way as the word Sabbath, which is a rest or a 7. The promise or rest are synonymous ideas. You can rest in God's promises, because if he's promised it, then you'll get it, if that makes sense. So that the idea of 7 has something of that, has a kind of promissory nature to it. A kind of you know, this is a done deal. There's something fixed here. And very often with that kind of when you have those sort of nuances of meaning, they lose something if the writer spelled out to you. That it's better that you've grown up and understood them, and you kind of feel it that way. That's often where the power is, and I suspect in the original listeners, that's how they would have felt it. Is there's a 7 there. There's something promissory about that. There's something that's kind of that we can bank on there. You can.
Oh yeah, that's really helpful. Yes, I suppose it sort of comes like revelation, doesn't it, when you see something,
Yeah,
and
that's
it
right.
does feel personal and God inspired. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas when someone tells you, it's kind of, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.